If you've always tried to be the harmless one, here's the uncomfortable truth. People don't reward safety, they erase it without noticing. Most people believe being harmless makes them respected, quiet, safe, easy to trust. But the social world doesn't run on safety, it runs on signal strength. The moment you remove the possibility of resistance, challenge, or consequence, something subtle happens. Attention drains away from you.
Not because people hate you, because nothing about you demands psychological space. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned that when a person cannot be dangerous, their kindness stops being a virtue and becomes background noise. Power isn't about aggression, it's about the visible capacity to act. When others sense that nothing follows your boundaries, your words lose weight, your presence loses tension, and your role quietly shifts from participant to furniture. And the disturbing part, most people never notice the exact moment this shift happens. At a basic psychological level, social visibility isn't earned by being pleasant. It's earned by creating a detectable range of possible responses. Human brains constantly scan for who can influence outcomes, who can change the emotional temperature of a room, and who must be factored into decisions. This happens fast, mostly below awareness. When someone appears completely harmless, the brain classifies them as low impact. Low-impact people require no strategic attention. They feel safe, but also optional. This is the tension behind what Friedrich Nietzsche described in his writings on strength and restraint. He argued that kindness only carries meaning when it comes from someone who clearly possesses the ability to act otherwise. If there is no visible capacity for resistance, then what looks like kindness is interpreted as limitation, not moral choice, structural inability. You can see this pattern in ordinary environments.
In workplaces, the person who never disagrees is trusted with tasks but rarely with decisions. In friend groups, the one who always adapts becomes the easiest to reschedule, interrupt, or overlook. Online, accounts that never express firm positions attract passive consumption, but almost no active engagement. None of this requires hostility from others. It's simply the natural result of attention flowing toward perceived leverage.
The core mechanism is simple. Humans prioritize signals of consequence. When your presence suggests that nothing significant will happen if you're ignored, the social system quietly reallocates focus elsewhere. Not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. And once that classification forms, reversing it becomes far harder than preventing it in the first place.
Here's the uncomfortable reversal most people never consider. Invisibility doesn't come from being weak. It comes from being perfectly predictable. A person who never interrupts, never refuses, never escalates, and never walks away becomes socially solved. Once others feel they fully understand your response range, their brain stops allocating energy to monitoring you. You're no longer a variable. You're a constant.
This is why extreme harmlessness often produces the opposite of what it intends. The goal is acceptance. The outcome is psychological disappearance. Not because others consciously devalue you, but because your behavior removes uncertainty. And uncertainty is what keeps human attention alive. This is the darker implication behind the warning from Friedrich Nietzsche. The issue was never kindness itself. The issue was the absence of visible choice. When restraint looks automatic instead of deliberate, observers don't read it as control. They read it as capacity limits. Your calm stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like default settings. Watch what happens in real situations. The moment someone who is normally agreeable calmly says no once, the room subtly recalibrates. Conversations slow.
People reassess tone.
Memory of that single deviation expands their perceived range. Nothing dramatic changed externally, but internally, the social map updated. And that map, the invisible estimate of what you could do, not what you usually do, determines whether people register your presence or unconsciously route around it. But here's where this gets dangerous. Once people classify you as harmless, they don't just ignore your boundaries, they stop even looking for them. And the longer that label sits, the more one small moment later can completely rewrite how everyone sees you. The question is, what specific signal actually forces that rewrite, and why most people send the wrong one? Power inside any group rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up as a quiet calculation. Whose reaction would actually change what happens next? The person believed capable of altering outcomes, socially, emotionally, or structurally, automatically receives more psychological weight. Not always more affection, but always more attention. This is why influence often concentrates around individuals who project controlled range rather than constant agreeableness. Think about how leadership perception forms in practice. When Angela Merkel negotiated inside the European Union, her public tone was measured and calm, almost understated. But everyone involved understood that behind that calm sat a demonstrated willingness to delay agreements, block proposals, or shift alliances if necessary. The visible capacity to act made restraint look intentional, not passive. Her quietness carried force because deviation was believable. The same structure appears in everyday hierarchies. In an office, two employees may both be friendly and cooperative. One occasionally questions unrealistic timelines, pushes back on unclear instructions, or calmly escalates issues when needed. The other absorbs everything silently. Over time, managers subconsciously route critical conversations toward the first person, not because they're louder, because their response range suggests consequence. The second employee becomes operationally useful, but strategically invisible. Even in social circles, this dynamic stabilizes fast. The friend who always says whatever works for everyone gradually stops being consulted on plans. The friend who sometimes says, "I can't do that," stays part of the decision loop. Nothing aggressive happened, but one person demonstrated boundaries that could affect group outcomes. This reflects the principle often associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. Power isn't constant action, it's recognized potential. Social systems don't rank people by how kind they are. They rank them by how much their choices must be considered. And the moment your reactions feel optional, your influence quietly drains, even if your intentions remain good. Underneath these social shifts sits a layered psychological process most people never consciously track. The first layer is predictive modeling. Human brains constantly build fast internal models of everyone nearby, how likely they are to resist, how strongly they hold preferences, how costly it would be to ignore them. This model updates not from what you say about yourself, but from tiny behavioral proofs repeated over time. If your past reactions show unlimited tolerance, the brain compresses you into a low volatility profile. Once compressed, you occupy less mental bandwidth, not disliked, just deprioritized. The second layer is attention economics. Groups instinctively distribute attention toward individuals who introduce uncertainty into outcomes. Uncertainty here doesn't mean chaos or aggression. It means credible agency. Someone whose decisions could redirect timelines, emotional climates, or resource flow becomes cognitively expensive to ignore. Their presence stays active in group calculations, even when they're silent. Meanwhile, someone perceived as permanently accommodating becomes cognitively cheap. Cheap signals fade into background processing. This connects directly to the tension described by Friedrich Nietzsche when he contrasted imposed meekness with chosen restraint. From a psychological standpoint, observers aren't evaluating morality, they're estimating optionality. When your restraint appears to be the only setting available, others don't register it as discipline, they register it as constraint. Discipline implies suppressed alternatives. Constraint implies none existed.
The third layer is memory weighting. Humans remember deviations far more than consistency. One calm but firm refusal can outweigh months of passive agreement because it expands the perceived boundaries of your behavior. The brain stores that moment as evidence that future interactions contain unknown variables. And once unknown variables exist, attention rises automatically.
This is why late boundary setting often feels dramatic, even when delivered quietly. It forces the entire predictive model to rebuild. Put together, these layers create a simple but unsettling equation. Visibility equals perceived agency multiplied by behavioral range. Reduce either long enough, and the system stops allocating space for you, not through hostility, but through silent optimization. And once that optimization locks in, changing it requires not louder behavior, but credible proof that the model itself was wrong. If you watch closely, this pattern shows up in very small, almost forgettable moments. Someone begins speaking, then pauses because another voice overlaps, and no one circles back to them. A message sits unanswered in a group chat, while faster, sharper replies pull the thread elsewhere. A suggestion gets polite nods, then quietly dissolves as the conversation moves on. Nothing openly hostile happens, no confrontation, no rejection, no visible conflict. Just a soft shift of collective focus. Most of the time, these moments pass without anyone labeling them as important. They feel like normal social noise. But taken together, they form the background rhythm of how attention moves. Not dramatically, just gradually, one unnoticed adjustment at a time. The unsettling truth is this: being harmless is not a virtue in the architecture of social perception. It is a liability. Harmlessness signals predictability, low impact, and optionality. People aren't plotting against you. They're simply optimizing their attention toward the variable, the capable, the person whose presence carries potential consequence. And in that optimization, your influence quietly erodes. This is where self-awareness becomes the real power play. Recognizing that social systems assign weight based on perceived agency allows you to reclaim space without aggression. The first step is observing your own patterns. When was the last time your agreement, compliance, or ease caused others to stop factoring you in? When was the last time a small deviation forced a recalibration of attention? These moments are proof points. They show that influence doesn't demand force, it demands credible choice. Leaders and figures who understand this, from historical statesmen to modern organizational heads, operate on controlled presence, not constant intervention. They never need to raise their voice to shift the room, because the room already estimates what will happen if they do. Your task then is to cultivate that internal signal, a silent but perceivable range of potential actions. Firm boundaries, selective compliance, and intentional deviations become the currency of visibility. The final takeaway is uncomfortable but liberating. Harmlessness is a default state, not a moral high ground. Your influence emerges not from being universally safe, but from being unpredictably significant in measured ways. By understanding the mechanisms that govern attention, you can step out of invisibility, not through aggression or coercion, but through deliberate calibration of presence. The choice to be noticed and respected is not external. It begins with how you allow yourself to be perceived. Pause for a moment and simply watch how people interact around you. Notice whose opinions shift the group's tone and whose words drift past without acknowledgement. Pay attention to moments when someone steps slightly out of pattern and the subtle recalibration it forces. These observations aren't about judgment or strategy. They're about awareness. Seeing who naturally carries weight and who doesn't trains your sense of social gravity. Over time, you begin to map the invisible currents of influence, spotting where attention flows and where it evaporates. Awareness alone begins the work of reclaiming presence before any action is taken. Here's the final hook: cold, analytical, and leaving the viewer unsettled. Most people go through life believing that being agreeable, harmless, and compliant keeps them safe. It doesn't. Safety, in social terms, is an illusion.
Harmlessness doesn't protect you. It erases you. Your absence isn't dramatic. It's silent. It's the unnoticed drift of attention, the invisible reallocation of focus toward anyone whose presence carries consequence. The disturbing part? By the time you realize it, your patterns are already assumed. Your voice doesn't need to be silenced for it to lose weight. It simply becomes optional.
And once that classification is set, every word, every gesture, every boundary must fight against a mental map that has already written you off. The path forward isn't aggression, it's measured recalibration. Every deliberate refusal, every intentional boundary, every subtle deviation signals that you are not entirely predictable. That unpredictability is the currency of presence.
Ask yourself this: how many times have you let harmlessness quietly define you? How many social spaces have already filtered you out without your notice? The moment to reclaim presence is now, not through force, but through calculated agency. The question that remains is haunting. If being harmless makes you invisible, then what exactly will it take for the world to finally notice you?